The Wyoming sun in the summer of 1871 was not a gentle thing. It was a furnace door swung wide open, blasting the plains with a heat that bleached the wild grasses to the color of bone and baked the earth into a cracked, brittle plate. For Emily Wren, it was a physical enemy, a weight pressing down on her shoulders as heavy as the one she already carried. That weight was her sister, Rosie, wrapped in a frayed wool blanket fashioned into a sling. Rosie's body was a limp and terrible burden against Emily's back. At 24, Emily was lean and strong, her muscles corded from a life of farm work. But 3 days of this had worn her down to a raw, trembling exhaustion. Every step sent a fresh stab of pain through her spine and into her legs. The dust, fine as flour, puffed up from under her worn boots, coating her dress, her face, her eyelashes, and finding its way into her throat to turn it to sandpaper. "Just a little farther, Rosie," she whispered, the words catching in her dry throat. "Just over the next rise. There's gotta be a town soon." There was no answer, only a faint, feverish murmur. Rosie's head, resting heavily in the crook of Emily's neck, radiated a heat that felt hotter than the sun. 18 years old and with hair the color of harvested wheat, Rosie was supposed to be laughing, her hands busy with a needlepoint, or her feet light in a dance at a town social. She was not supposed to be burning from the inside out, lost in a delirium that brought phantom whispers of their mother's name to her cracked lips. This was a land that did not forgive. It was vast and empty, a sprawling canvas of muted greens and dusty browns under a sky so immense and blue it felt like a judgment. The silence was the worst part. It was a living thing, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush and the frantic, desperate beat of Emily's own heart. There were no birds singing, no signs of life save for a hawk circling high above, a patient, dark speck against the endless blue. Emily tried not to look at it. She knew what it was waiting for. Their world had shrunk to this agonizing journey 2 weeks ago. It had started with a cough, a simple ailment they'd treated with boiled honey and lemon from their small stores. But the cough had deepened, settling in Rosie's chest before the fever bloomed. Hot and fast. It was the same fever. Emily knew with a cold certainty that lived in her gut, the same that had taken their mother in the spring, and their father just as the summer began. They had buried them both on the small rise behind the homestead, under the lone cottonwood tree, the 2 graves marked with simple wooden crosses that Emily had carved herself. After that, the silence in their small, sturdy cabin had become as profound as the silence of the plains. They were alone. The nearest neighbor was a day's ride away, and they hadn't seen anyone since Pa's funeral. The homestead, once a place of life and toil, became a fortress against grief. Emily had taken on all the chores, chopping wood, mending fences, tending to their meager livestock, all while a fierce, protective fire burned inside her. She would not lose Rosie. She would not be the last one left. But the fever had not respected their solitude. When Rosie had stopped making sense, when her eyes had glazed over and she'd begun calling for their PA, Emily knew the homestead had become a tomb in waiting. The herbs and poultices had done nothing. Rosie needed a doctor. The closest one she knew of was in a town called Hope's End, a place their father had spoken of. He'd said it was a 3-day ride, maybe 4 if the weather turned. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one she had. She had packed what little they had a skin of water, now terrifyingly light, a small sack with a few strips of jerky and a chunk of hardtack, nearly gone, and their father's old Colt revolver, tucked securely into the waistband of her skirt. She'd hoisted Rosie onto her back, her sister's light frame a dead weight, and started walking east, leaving the graves and the silent cabin behind them. Now, on the 3rd day, Hope was a flickering ember about to be stamped out by the dust. The water was gone. She had tipped the last few precious drops onto a rag and wiped Rosie's lips an hour ago, a gesture that felt as futile as praying for rain in the heart of a drought. Her own thirst was a living creature, clawing at her throat. Her vision swam at the edges, the horizon blurring and wavering in the heat. "Mama, so cold," Rosie mumbled, her voice a fragile thread of sound. A violent shiver racked her body, a stark contrast to the fire Emily felt on her skin. "I know, sweet girl, I know," Emily soothed, adjusting the blanket. The movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her shoulders. She gritted her teeth, tasting the salt of her own sweat and the grit of the earth. She thought of her father's hands, calloused and kind, and the way he could gentle a nervous horse with just a word. She thought of her mother's smile, a rare and beautiful thing, and the scent of baking bread that used to fill their small home. These memories were all she had, fragments of a life that felt a world away. They were both a comfort and a torment, fuel for her journey and a reminder of everything she stood to lose. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal shades of orange and red, as if the day itself were bleeding out. The heat lessened, but a different kind of chill began to creep across the plains. The nights were cold and filled with the cries of coyotes, lonely and predatory sounds that made the world feel even larger and more menacing. Emily stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose rock. She cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound, and fell heavily to one knee. The impact jolted Rosie, who let out a soft moan. For a long moment, Emily couldn't move. The pain in her ankle was a dull, throbbing fire, but it was the overwhelming wave of despair that truly paralyzed her. It would be so easy to stop, so easy to just lie down here, to pull Rosie close and let the cold, starry night take them. The thought was a dark, seductive whisper in her mind. No more pain, no more thirst, no more walking, just an end. Her father's last words echoed in her memory, his voice raspy and weak, but full of a desperate strength. "Emily, you look after your sister. You promise me." She had promised. With a guttural sob that was part rage and part grief, Emily forced herself to move. She pushed against the unyielding ground, her muscles screaming in protest. She ignored the pain in her ankle, ignored the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, ignored the voice in her head that told her it was all for nothing. She got one foot under her, then the other, leaning forward, using the momentum of Rosie's weight. She pushed herself upright. She stood there, swaying, a solitary, desperate figure against the vast, darkening landscape. She took one step, then another. The world had narrowed to this single, brutal task. Lift one foot, put it down, then the other. Don't look at the hawk. Don't think about the water. Don't think about how heavy Rosie was, or how hot her skin felt, or how the silence seemed to be pressing in from all sides. Just walk. The land stretched on before her, an endless rolling sea of darkening plains. There was no sign of a town, no distant curl of smoke, no glimmer of a lamp in a window. There was nothing, just the dry earth, the vast sky, and the two of them, a tiny, struggling speck of life in a world that did not seem to care whether they lived or died. But Emily Wren kept walking, her father's promise a shield against despair, her love for her sister the only fuel she had left. She walked on into the twilight, unaware that her silhouette, etched against the dying light, was being watched from a distant ridge. The world had begun to dissolve at the edges, the horizon, once a sharp line separating the dusty earth from the bruised purple sky, was now a soft, indistinct blur. Each breath Emily took was a ragged, shallow thing that did little to ease the burning in her lungs. Her legs were no longer her own. They were wooden stilts, moving by some mechanical memory she no longer controlled. She had stopped thinking about Hope's End, stopped thinking about a doctor. Her entire universe had contracted to the next step, and the one after that. Just one more. Then she heard it. It was a sound so out of place in the profound silence that at first she thought she had imagined it, a phantom of her exhausted mind, a soft, rhythmic beat. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of hooves on hard-packed earth, steady and unhurried. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of her fatigue. It was a primal instinct, the fear of the hunted. She was a lone woman, encumbered and weak, in a land where mercy was a currency scarcer than water. She stopped, swaying on her feet, her head cocked to listen. The sound grew louder, closer. It was real. Slowly, deliberately. Her right hand moved from supporting Rosie's weight to the small of her back, her fingers closing around the cold, familiar grip of her father's Colt. The weight of it was a small, solid reassurance in a world that had become fluid and treacherous. A figure emerged from the deepening twilight, a dark shape cresting a low rise to the west. A man on a horse. The silhouette was stark against the last vestiges of the sunset broad shoulders. A wide-brimmed hat, the long line of a rifle in a scabbard beside his leg. He was moving at a walk, not a gallop, but to Emily. He seemed to be bearing down on her with the speed and inevitability of a storm. She shifted Rosie's weight, planting her feet as firmly as she could on the uneven ground. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the slow, steady approach of the horse. She would not look like easy prey. She lifted her chin, trying to project a strength she did not feel. The rider reined in his horse about 30 feet away, a distance that was both respectful and cautious. The horse, a big roan with intelligent eyes, blew softly through its nostrils. The man didn't speak. He just sat there in the saddle, watching her. In the fading light, she could make out more details. He was tall, even seated. His clothes were dusty and practical canvas trousers, a dark, collarless shirt, and a worn leather vest. He wasn't a drifter. His gear was too well kept. The horse was well fed. The leather of the saddle and bridle cared for. This was a man who knew how to survive out here. That made him more dangerous, not less. His face was shadowed by his hat, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. It wasn't leering or aggressive. It was assessing. His eyes moved from her face, down to the trembling in her arms, and finally rested on the small, still form of Rosie on her back. A long moment passed, stretched thin by the tension. "That's a heavy load for this kind of country?" "Ma'am," he finally said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a slow river. It was calm, without any discernible threat. Yet it did nothing to soothe the fear coiling in Emily's stomach. "We're managing," she replied, her own voice coming out as a harsh croak. She was furious at its weakness. The man nodded slowly, his gaze still on Rosie. "Looks like more than just a heavy load. Your girl is burning with fever." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, spoken with a quiet authority that unnerved her. How could he know from that distance? "That's our business," Emily said, her knuckles white where she gripped the revolver. The stranger seemed to register the movement of her hand, the defensive posture. He made no move for his own weapons. Instead, he rested his hands plainly on the saddle horn. It was a deliberate gesture of peace. "My name is Luke Kerrigan," he said. "I'm hauling freight to Fort Laramie for the Army. I mean you no harm." Emily said nothing. Names meant little out here. A man could be whoever he said he was. Luke shifted slightly in his saddle. "I've seen that kind of fever before," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with something that sounded like old sadness. "You need to get her cooled down. And you need water. I can hear your thirst from here." He reached for the canteen hanging from his saddle. It was a large one, and the sound of water sloshing within it was the most beautiful and terrible sound Emily had ever heard. It was the sound of life, and it was in his possession, not hers. "We don't need anything from you," she lied, the words scraping her throat. Pride was a foolish, deadly thing, but it was all she had left. Luke ignored her protest. He uncorked the canteen and swung his leg over the saddle, dismounting with a fluid ease that spoke of a life spent on horseback. He moved without hurry, his steps measured. He was tall taller than her father had been, with a lean, hard strength to his frame. As he drew closer, she saw his face more clearly. He was perhaps near 30, with a square jaw darkened by stubble and eyes the color of a stormy sky. There were lines etched at their corners, lines of hardship or sorrow. She couldn't tell which. He looked tired, not just from a day's ride, but a deeper, more permanent kind of weary. He stopped 10 feet from her. "Your pride is going to get you both killed," he said, not unkindly. He held out the canteen. "Give her some first, just a little on a cloth for her lips. Then you drink, and drink slowly." Emily stared at the canteen as if it were a coiled snake. Her mind screamed at her to take it, but a lifetime of caution, of her father's warnings about strangers on the trail, held her back. This was how it happened. A moment of kindness, a lowered guard, and then everything was lost. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low and suspicious. Luke's gaze met hers, and for the first time she saw past the weary exterior to the man beneath. There was no guile in his eyes, only a profound, somber understanding. "I want to not ride past a woman and a sick child and leave them to die in the dirt," he said simply. "There are things a man can live with, and things he can't. That's one I can't." He took a step closer and set the canteen on the ground between them. Then he backed away, returning to his horse, giving her space. The gesture was one of trust, a risk he was taking on her. He was leaving his water, his lifeblood, at her feet. For a long minute, Emily was frozen in a battle with herself. The thirst was a roaring fire. Rosie's life was guttering like a candle flame, and here was a stranger, offering an oasis in the desert. Her father's warnings warred with her father's practicality. He had also taught her that sometimes you had to take a chance to survive. Her body made the decision for her. Her knees buckled. With a small cry, she sank to the ground, managing to cushion Rosie's body as she fell. The Colt remained in her hand, but the fight had drained out of her, replaced by the crushing weight of her failure. Tears she had refused to shed for days burned hot behind her eyes. Luke was beside her in an instant, moving with a surprising quickness. He didn't touch her, but knelt a few feet away, his presence a solid, steady thing in her dissolving world. "It's all right," he said, his voice gentle. "You've done all you can. You've carried her far enough." He reached for the canteen, uncorked it, and wet his own handkerchief, the fabric dark and cool. He held it out to her. "For your sister," he prompted. Her hand trembled as she took it. The cloth was blessedly cool. She turned and gently dabbed at Rosie's lips, which were cracked and dry. Rosie sighed in her delirium, a small, pained sound, but she seemed to lean into the moisture after cleaning her sister's lips. Emily watched as Luke poured a small amount of water into the cap and offered it to her. She drank, the water shocking her system, a miracle on her tongue. It was the taste of survival. Luke watched her, his expression unreadable. He looked at Rosie, limp and pale against Emily's shoulder. Then at Emily's exhausted frame, the raw, chafed skin on her neck where the blanket sling had dug in, the grim set of her jaw. He saw the whole story in a single, heartbreaking picture, the grief, the desperation, and the fierce, unbreakable will that had brought her this far. He knew she couldn't get up again, not with Rosie on her back. He knew that even if she did, she wouldn't make it another mile. He had seen this kind of ending before, on battlefields littered with boys who had fought with more courage than strength, their bodies giving out long after their spirits had. He stood up, a tall, solid shadow against the rising moon. Emily tensed, her hand tightening on the gun again, instinct overriding the relief of the water. He didn't look at the weapon. He looked at her, his gaze direct and clear. He wasn't asking for permission, nor was he issuing a command. He was stating a new reality, one she was too weak to fight any longer. "You can't carry her alone anymore," he said, his voice quiet but leaving no room for argument. He took a step forward, his shadow falling over her. "So we won't." Emily looked up at him, her tear-streaked, dusty face a mask of confusion and defiance. He knelt again, meeting her gaze. The weariness in his eyes seemed to hold the sorrow of 100 empty plains, of 1,000 lonely nights. "We'll carry her together." The words hung in the air, a promise so profound and unexpected that for a moment, Emily couldn't process them. "We'll carry her together." The sentiment was so foreign, so contrary to the solitary battle she had been waging, that it felt like a language she had forgotten how to speak. She stared up at Luke Kerrigan, at the stark lines of his face softened by the twilight, and saw not a threat, but a strange and solemn reflection of her own exhaustion. The strength that had held her upright for 3 days finally gave way, not to despair, but to a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. She gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture that cost her the last of her reserves. Luke took it as the assent it was. There was no wasted motion in the man. He moved with a quiet efficiency that Emily suspected was hard-won. First, he gently coaxed the revolver from her numb fingers, not to disarm her, but to free her hands. He laid it carefully on the ground beside her before turning his attention to Rosie. "Let's get her on my horse," he said, his voice low and steady. "He's a calm beast. She'll be safer there than on my back if I stumble." He worked with a surprising tenderness, his large, calloused hands untying the knots of the blanket sling with a gentle precision. Emily watched, a detached observer of her own rescue. As he gathered Rosie into his arms, he lifted her as if she were made of glass, her small, feverish body cradled against his broad chest. For an instant, seeing her sister in the arms of a stranger sent a fresh spike of fear through Emily, but it was quickly tempered by the sheer relief of the shared weight. Luke carried Rosie to his roan, speaking to the animal in a low murmur, and settled her carefully in the saddle, propped against the horn and secured with a length of rope from his bedroll. "There now," he said, adjusting the blanket around Rosie's shoulders. "You drink the rest of that water. All of it. I know where we can find more." He then helped Emily to her feet. She was unsteady, her ankles screaming in protest, but she stood. He handed her the reins of his horse. "You lead him. I'll walk alongside." He didn't know about her ankle, but his decision to have her lead the horse while he walked was another small act of grace, whether he knew it or not. They moved slowly through the deepening darkness, a strange, silent procession of 3 souls adrift in the vast emptiness of Wyoming. The moon had risen, a sliver of bone white in an inky sky, offering just enough light to see the ground before them. For what felt like an hour, they walked in silence, broken only by the plodding of the horse and Rosie's occasional, restless murmurs. Luke seemed to know exactly where he was going, navigating by the stars and the shape of the distant hills with an easy confidence. Finally, he stopped, pointing toward a dark mound on the landscape. "There," he said. "Old hunter's outpost. Not much, but it's got walls and a roof that mostly holds." As they drew closer, Emily saw it was a small sod house, built low to the ground, its roof a thatch of wild grasses growing over a frame of old cottonwood. It was a crude, lonely structure, looking as if it had sprouted from the earth itself. The door hung askew on one leather hinge, and a dark, empty square marked the place where a window might have been. But it was shelter. It was a haven from the wind that was now starting to whip across the plains, carrying the chill of the high country. Luke pushed the door open, the sound a low groan of weathered wood. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old dust, dry rot, and the faint, gamey smell of long-ago animal hides. A pack rat scurried for cover in the corner, by the faint moonlight slanting through the doorway. Emily could see it was a single, small room with a dirt floor, a broken-down cot in one corner, and a stone hearth black with the soot of 1,000 fires. It was bleak and abandoned, but to Emily, it felt like a palace. Luke immediately set to work. He gently lifted Rosie from the horse and carried her inside, laying her on the cot, which he first covered with his own bedroll, while Emily sank down onto the floor, her body finally surrendering to its limits. He gathered dry brush and wood from a small pile stacked against the outer wall and, with a flint and steel, coaxed a small flame to life in the hearth. The fire caught, spitting and crackling, and a warm, golden light pushed back the oppressive darkness, filling the small space with dancing shadows. It was the most welcoming sight Emily had ever seen. For the next few hours, they worked in a state of quiet, focused collaboration. Luke took a bucket he found near the hearth and disappeared into the night, returning with it full of cool, clean water from a seep he knew of nearby. They had water, they had fire, they had shelter. It was a trinity of miracles. Emily's strength began to return in small increments, fueled by a strip of jerky from Luke's pack and sips of water. She focused all her energy on Rosie. She soaked strips of cloth torn from her own petticoat in the cool water and laid them across her sister's forehead, her neck, her wrists, trying to draw out the terrible heat. Rosie moaned and thrashed weakly, lost in her fever dream. Luke watched her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he stepped back outside. He returned a short time later, his hands full of leaves and sprigs he'd gathered in the moonlight. He held them out for her to see. "Yarrow," he said, pointing to a feathery leaf. "It'll make her sweat. Help the fever break." He indicated a strip of pale bark. "Willow, for the pain. And this is mint. It'll calm her stomach." Emily stared at the collection of plants, then up at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "How do you know this?" "My mother," he said simply. He took a small tin pot from his saddlebag, filled it with water, and set it on the edge of the hearth to warm. He crushed the leaves and bark between two stones, the movements practiced and sure. She was a healer. He didn't elaborate, and Emily didn't press. She watched as he steeped the herbs in the hot water, the air filling with a sharp, clean scent. When it had cooled slightly, he dipped a cloth in the makeshift tea and, with a hand that was surprisingly gentle for its size, squeezed a few drops between Rosie's lips. He worked with a quiet patience, a deep-seated competence that was both calming and mystifying. This rough-looking man, this teamster, knew more about medicine than anyone she had ever met. The night wore on. They settled into a rhythm, a shared vigil in the flickering firelight. They took turns bathing Rosie's face and giving her sips of the willow bark tea. The silence between them was no longer tense or suspicious, but comfortable, filled by the crackling of the fire and the sound of their breathing, in the quiet intimacy of the small, warm room. The walls of the world outside seemed to fall away, leaving only the three of them. "She was a nurse," Luke said suddenly, his voice soft. He was staring into the flames, his face a mask of old memories. "With the army, during the war. She said a man's uniform didn't change the color of his blood. She'd tend to anyone who was brought to her, blue or gray." Emily looked over at him. That must have been hard for her. He gave a sad, small smile. "She was the strongest person I ever knew. Taught me which plants could heal and which could harm. Taught me how to set a bone and stitch a wound. Said a man who couldn't take care of himself or the people around him wasn't much of a man at all." A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. Rosie had settled into a fitful sleep, her breathing still shallow but less ragged than before. "Rosie is all I have left," Emily heard herself say, the words an admission of a vulnerability she hadn't intended to share. "Our folks, they were taken by the same fever this spring." Luke looked at her, and the sorrow she had seen in his eyes earlier returned, deeper this time. He nodded slowly, a profound understanding passing between them. He knew this particular kind of grief, the kind that hollowed you out and left you standing alone. "I had a sister, too," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't look at her, but kept his gaze fixed on the fire, as if the story were written in the embers. "Her name was Clara. She was just 16. All sunshine and ribbons, my mother used to say. He paused, and the silence was heavy with the weight of a loss that time had not managed to dull. It was after the war. I had just come home. A sickness swept through our town. Diphtheria. It took the children fastest. Clara caught it, her throat. It started to close up. She couldn't breathe. He swallowed hard, and Emily could see the muscles in his jaw working. There was a doctor 2 towns over. A full day's ride. I put her in a wagon. I drove those horses harder than I've ever driven them, before or since. I could hear her behind me, fighting for every breath. The sound, I still hear it at night. His voice cracked, and he fell silent. Emily didn't move, didn't breathe. She felt as if she were standing on sacred ground, a place of private grief he rarely, if ever, allowed anyone to enter. By the time we got there, he continued, his voice flat and dead, it was too late. The doctor, he was a good man. He did what he could, but she was gone. I was sitting right beside her, holding her hand, and I couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. He finally turned to look at Emily, and his eyes were raw with a pain that was more than a decade old but as fresh as a new wound. I wasn't fast enough, he said. So when I saw you out there today, when I saw you carrying her, fighting for her, I couldn't just ride by. I couldn't be too late again. The confession settled in the space between them, a heartbreaking truth that explained everything. He wasn't just helping her. He was trying to save himself from a ghost. He was trying to grant a stranger the chance he never had. Emily felt the last of her defenses crumble. The tears she had fought back for so long finally came, silent and hot, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. They weren't tears of despair anymore, but of a shared, aching humanity. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She couldn't. There were no words for that kind of loss. Instead, she just met his gaze, letting him see the understanding in her own eyes, letting him know that his story was safe with her. She understood the terrible weight of responsibility, the desperate race against time, the fear of being the one left behind. He wasn't a stranger anymore. He was Luke, and in the heart of that desolate, abandoned hut, surrounded by the vast and indifferent wilderness, Emily Wren, for the first time in a long time, was not alone. The burden was finally, truly shared. The dawn that broke over the abandoned sod hut was pale and tentative, a fragile truce between the darkness of the night and the coming glare of the day. Inside, the small fire had burned down to a bed of glowing orange embers, casting a soft, warm light on the scene. Rosie was still asleep, her breathing a little deeper, her skin still hot to the touch but no longer radiating the terrifying, dry heat of the day before. The yarrow tea had worked its small magic, leaving a faint sheen of sweat on her brow. It wasn't a cure, but it was a reprieve, a breath of hope. Emily was awake, watching her sister. She had taken the second watch, insisting that Luke get some rest. He had slept for a few hours, a deep, motionless sleep on the hard-packed dirt floor, his hat tipped over his eyes. Seeing him there, vulnerable in his rest, a man who had appeared out of nowhere and given them everything, his water, his knowledge, his strength stirred a feeling in her that was as foreign as it was profound. It was gratitude, so immense it felt like a physical ache in her chest. When he woke, it was with the quiet stillness of a man accustomed to waking in wild places. One moment he was asleep, the next he was sitting up, fully alert, his gaze immediately going to Rosie, then to Emily. "Any change?" he asked, his voice still rough with sleep. "Her fever feels a little less," Emily said, her voice a hopeful whisper. "She's resting more peacefully." Luke nodded, pushing himself to his feet. "Good. We'll let her rest a bit more while I check on the horse and scout the trail ahead. We should move as soon as there's enough light." The morning routine was one of shared, unspoken purpose. While Luke tended to his roan, Emily used the last of the herbal tea to wet Rosie's lips. When he returned, They shared the last of his jerky and a handful of dried berries he produced from his saddlebag, a small feast that felt more satisfying than any meal Emily could remember. There was a new dynamic between them, a partnership forged in the crucible of the previous night's desperation and confession. The suspicion in Emily's heart had been washed away, replaced by a cautious but steady trust. When it was time to leave, the question of how to carry Rosie was answered before it was asked. Luke fashioned a new sling from his own bedroll, stronger and better padded than Emily's. He lifted Rosie as gently as he had the night before and settled her onto his own back. The burden that had nearly broken Emily was now his. He adjusted the weight, his face set in a determined line, and gave a small nod, indicating he was ready. "I'll lead the horse," Emily said. Taking the reins, her ankle was still sore, but the night's rest had eased the worst of the pain. Walking without the crushing weight on her back felt like freedom. The journey resumed under a sky that had cleared to a pale, washed-out blue. The landscape was the same vast, unforgiving, and empty, but Emily's perception of it had changed. It was no longer a solitary enemy to be conquered. Now, it was a path they walked together. She found herself watching Luke, the steady, rhythmic pace he kept despite his heavy load, the broad set of his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. He moved with the land, not against it, a man who had made his peace with its harshness. The silence of the previous day's desperate march was replaced by the quiet sounds of their progress and, eventually, by the sound of their voices. The conversation started slowly. Small observations about the terrain, about the signs of water, but as the miles stretched on, it deepened, flowing into the empty spaces of their pasts. "My pa built our cabin with his own 2 hands," Emily found herself saying, her gaze on a distant, crumbling homestead. Its roof caved in like a broken spine. He was a carpenter back east. He thought this land was a new beginning, a place to be free. "It's a hard place to be free in," Luke commented, his voice steady. "The winters were the worst," she continued, the memory surfacing, sharp and clear. "Our second winter here, the snows came early. We were trapped in the cabin for a month. The wind, it sounded like a dying thing, howling day and night. We ran out of firewood. Pa had to chop up the rocking chair Mama had brought all the way from Ohio just to keep the fire going. We lived on dried beans and melted snow. I remember being so hungry my stomach felt like it was eating itself." She wasn't looking for pity. She was just telling the story, giving voice to a hardship that had shaped her. "But we made it." Pa always said, "Wrens are tough birds. We know how to survive the winter." Luke was silent for a long time, and Emily wondered if she had said too much. But when he spoke, his voice was filled with a quiet understanding. "After the war, I didn't know what to do with myself," he began, his eyes on the horizon. "For 4 years, someone was always telling you where to march, when to eat, when to fight. Then one day, it's over. They give you your last pay and point you down the road. The whole world is in front of you, and you've never felt more lost." He shifted Rosie's weight on his back. "I tried farming for a spell, back in Missouri. Couldn't stand it. The silence of the fields felt louder than the cannons. I kept seeing ghosts in the corn rows. So I started moving, took jobs on riverboats, worked a cattle drive up from Texas, did some scouting for the railroad. Anything to keep from standing still." "You were running," Emily said softly. He glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes that she understood. "I suppose I was. Running from memories. Running from the man I had to be in the war. It took me years to realize you can't outrun yourself. You just get tired. Eventually, you have to find a piece of ground and stand on it." They walked on, the shared stories weaving an invisible thread between them. They were 2 survivors of different wars, one fought with cannons and rifles, the other with snow and starvation. Both had left scars that weren't visible to the eye. The burden they shared was not just the physical weight of Rosie, but the weight of their own histories. By midday, the weather began to turn. The pale blue sky grew heavy. bruised with dark, swollen clouds that rolled in from the west. The air became thick and still, charged with an electric tension. The wind died down, and an eerie silence fell over the plains. "Storm's coming," Luke said, his voice low, a bad one. He scanned the landscape. His eyes narrowed. "There, see that outcropping? If we move fast, we can make it there before it breaks." He quickened his pace, and Emily urged the horse into a trot to keep up. The first drop of rain was a single, fat splat in the dust at her feet, then another, and another. Within minutes, the heavens opened up. It wasn't rain, it was a deluge, a solid, blinding sheet of water that turned the world to a gray, roaring blur. The wind hit them like a physical blow, whipping Emily's skirt around her legs and tearing at Luke's hat. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so loud it seemed to split the sky in two, and the horse shied, its eyes wide with terror. "Easy, boy! Easy!" Emily shouted over the roar of the storm, gripping the reins tightly. Luke was already there, one hand on the horse's bridle, the other shielding Rosie's face from the lashing rain. The cave. Get to the cave. They scrambled the last 100 yards, fighting against the wind and the slick, muddy ground. The outcropping Luke had seen concealed the dark mouth of a shallow cave, a hollow carved out of the rock by centuries of wind and water. It was their only sanctuary. They stumbled inside, dripping and gasping for breath. The roar of the storm suddenly muffled, replaced by the sound of water streaming down the rocks and the echo of their own ragged breathing. The cave was small and damp, smelling of wet stone and earth, but it was dry. Luke eased Rosie from his back and laid her on a patch of sandy ground in the furthest corner, wrapping her in his now soaked bedroll. He then immediately set about building a fire in the mouth of the cave. Using the last of his dry kindling and a few pieces of wood he managed to find in the protected crevices of the rock. Emily stood there, shivering, watching him. The horse stood just inside the entrance, its flanks trembling. Outside, the storm raged, a wild and violent symphony of wind and water. And here, in this small, protected space, they were safe. The contrast was overwhelming. The terror of the storm, the grueling journey, the days of fear and hopelessness, all of it crashed down on her at once. A single, ragged sob escaped her lips. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle it, but it was followed by another, and another. The dam of her resilience, the wall she had so carefully constructed around her heart, finally broke. The tears she had held back for weeks, for months, since the first sign of her mother's illness, came in a hot, unstoppable flood. She sank to the floor of the cave, wrapped her arms around her knees, and wept. She cried for her mother and father, for the life that had been stolen from them. She cried for Rosie, so small and fragile, burning with a fire no one could seem to quench. She cried for herself, for the crushing loneliness and the terror of being left all alone. She cried out all the fear, all the grief, all the exhaustion she had carried in silence for so long. Luke stopped his work at the fire and turned to her, in the flickering light of the new flames. His face was filled with a deep, aching compassion. He didn't speak. He simply moved to her side, knelt down on the cold stone floor, and wrapped his arms around her. His embrace was not one of passion, but of pure, solid comfort. It was the embrace of a fortress, a steady anchor in her swirling sea of grief. She leaned into him, burying her face in the rough, damp fabric of his shirt, and let herself fall apart. He held her firmly, one hand stroking her hair, the other a solid weight on her back, simply holding her together as she wept. He didn't offer empty words or false promises. He just offered his presence, his strength, a silent testament that she was no longer bearing her sorrow alone. He was sharing this burden, too, and in the heart of the storm, sheltered in the arms of a man she had met only a day before, Emily Wren finally, truly, let go. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. A pale, watery sun broke through the clouds, and the plains, which had been a uniform dusty brown, were now dotted with the ephemeral green of life renewed. They left the shelter of the cave and continued their journey, the air cool and fresh against their skin. The new day felt like a gift, a second chance. Luke still carried Rosie, his stride long and unbroken, a testament to a strength that seemed to have no bottom. Emily led the horse, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The release of the previous night's tears had cleansed her, leaving not emptiness but a quiet, fragile space where hope could begin to take root. They walked for hours, speaking little, conserving their energy for the final push. The landscape began to change, the flat plains giving way to low, rolling hills dotted with pine and juniper. It was a sign, Luke had told her, that they were getting closer to civilization. It was late in the afternoon when he stopped and pointed. "Look there." Emily followed his gaze, her hand shielding her eyes against the sun. On the horizon, nestled in a shallow valley where a small creek snaked its way through a grove of cottonwoods, was a tiny curl of smoke rising straight into the still air, and beneath it, a collection of small, dark shapes that slowly resolved into buildings. Hope's End. The name itself was a prayer, and the sight of it sent a wave of relief through Emily so powerful it made her knees weak. She had done it. She had brought her sister here. Tears welled in her eyes again, but these were not tears of grief. They were tears of a desperate, bone-deep gratitude. It took them another hour to reach the outskirts of the town. Hope's End was not much more than a single, muddy street lined with a dozen or so rough-hewn buildings. There was a general store with a sagging porch, a blacksmith's shop from which the rhythmic clang of a hammer echoed, a squat, windowless building that was unmistakably a saloon, and a handful of small cabins. A few people stopped what they were doing to stare at the strange trio, the big man with the sick girl on his back, the exhausted, mud-streaked woman leading his horse. Their faces were curious but guarded, the typical expression of a frontier town where strangers were as likely to be trouble as they were to be trade. Luke paid them no mind. He stopped a man who was loading a barrel onto a wagon. "We're looking for the doctor," he said, his voice calm and direct. The man grunted, wiping a sweaty brow with the back of his arm. He looked from Luke to the still form of Rosie, and his expression softened slightly. "That'd be Doc Vance, last cabin on the right, the one with the herb garden out front." "You can't miss it." They found it easily. It was a small but sturdy log cabin, set a little apart from the others, with a neatly tended garden of medicinal plants and a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. Luke didn't hesitate. He walked straight up to the door and knocked, his knuckles rapping sharply against the thick wood. The door was opened by a man who looked as old and weathered as the hills themselves. He was stooped and thin, with a fringe of white hair and a face that was a roadmap of wrinkles. His eyes, however, were sharp and intelligent, peering at them from beneath bushy white eyebrows. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "We need a doctor," Luke said. "This girl is burning with lung fever. She needs help." The old man's sharp eyes immediately fell on Rosie, and his entire demeanor changed. The cantankerous facade dropped away, replaced by a focused, professional urgency. "Don't just stand there, son. Bring her in. Bring her in. Lay her on the table." He shuffled back into the cabin, and Luke followed, carrying Rosie inside as if she were his own. Emily tied the horse to a hitching post and hurried in after them. The inside of the cabin was one large room, meticulously organized and smelling of carbolic acid, dried herbs, and old paper. One side was clearly a living space, with a cot, a small table, and a bookshelf crammed with thick volumes. The other side was a clinic, dominated by a long wooden examination table and shelves lined with glass bottles of all shapes and sizes, filled with tinctures and powders. "Doctor," Vance was already at work, his gnarled fingers surprisingly deft as he unwrapped the blankets from Rosie. "How long has she been like this?" he snapped, not looking up.
"The fever started more than a week ago,"
Emily answered, her voice trembling.
"It's gotten much worse these last few days."
"What have you given her?" he asked, pressing a stethoscope to Rosie's chest and listening intently.
"Water, mostly, and we made a tea,"
Emily said, glancing at Luke. "Yarrow, willow bark, and mint," Luke added. The doctor grunted, a sound that could have been approval. "Better than nothing. At least you didn't pour whiskey down her throat like some fools." He straightened up, his face grim. "It's as you said. Son, lung fever. A bad case of it. Her breathing is shallow. We need to get the fluid out and the fever down. And we need to do it now." For the next hour, Emily watched in a state of suspended animation as Dr. Vance and Luke worked to save her sister. The doctor was a whirlwind of motion, barking orders that Luke followed without question. They filled hot water bottles to pack around Rosie's chest, forced sips of a bitter-smelling tincture between her lips, and rubbed her limbs to keep the circulation going. Luke was a steady, calming presence, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he helped prop Rosie up or hold her still. Emily stood by the hearth, feeling useless, a spectator at the most important battle of her life. She watched them work, her entire being focused on the small, still form on the table. She saw the doctor press his ear to Rosie's back, listening. She saw him nod, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. She heard him say, "The congestion is breaking. That's a good sign." A good sign. The words echoed in Emily's head. For the first time in days, the suffocating knot of fear in her chest began to loosen. She had gotten her here. Rosie was in good hands. She was going to be all right. The doctor had said so. And then the world tilted on its axis. The edges of her vision turned dark. The sounds in the room, the crackling fire, the doctor's raspy voice. Luke's low murmur fading as if coming from a great distance. The strength that had carried her across the plains, the adrenaline that had fueled her through the fear and the exhaustion, all of it left her in a single, silent rush. Her body, having completed its monumental task, simply gave up. Her knees buckled, and without a sound, she crumpled to the floor in a heap of worn calico and utter exhaustion. The last thing she remembered was Luke's voice calling her name, his face swimming above her, his stormy eyes filled with a new and urgent concern. When she woke, it was to the smell of beef broth and the unfamiliar sensation of a soft mattress beneath her. She was on the doctor's cot, a thick wool blanket pulled up to her chin. The light in the room was the soft, gray light of late evening. She sat up slowly, her head spinning. Her body ached with a deep, profound weariness, but the sharp, stabbing pains were gone, replaced by a dull, heavy soreness. She looked across the room. Rosie was still on the examination table, but she was propped up with pillows, and her breathing was visibly easier. A soft, regular rhythm that was the most beautiful sound in the world. And in a chair beside the table, silhouetted against the firelight, sat Luke. He wasn't sleeping. He was just sitting there, watching over them, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. He was a guardian, a silent, steadfast sentinel. He must have sensed her stirring, because he turned his head. Their eyes met across the small, quiet room. He didn't smile, but the hard lines of his face seemed to soften. "Welcome back," he said, his voice low. "The doctor said you just needed rest. You've had a long journey." Rosie, Emily whispered, her throat dry. "She's better," Luke said, and the relief in his voice was palpable. "The fever broke about an hour ago. Doc Vance says she's not out of the woods yet, but she's on the right side of the fight now. She's strong, like her sister." Emily lay back against the pillow, a wave of emotion so intense it left her breathless, washing over her. She closed her eyes, letting the truth of it sink in. They were safe. Rosie was safe. A few minutes later, Luke was beside her cot, holding a steaming mug. The doctor said you need to drink this. All of it. She took the mug, her fingers brushing against his. The brief contact sent a strange warmth through her, a small spark in the landscape of her exhaustion. She drank the broth slowly, the hot, salty liquid a balm to her empty stomach and frayed nerves. He stood beside her until she was finished, his presence a quiet, comforting weight in the room. For the next 2 days, the small cabin became their entire world. Dr. Vance, satisfied that his patients were stable, left them in Luke's care while he tended to his other duties in town. Checking in every few hours, Luke became their nurse, their cook, their protector. He moved about the small space with an easy, unhurried competence, changing the compresses on Rosie's brow, spooning broth into Emily's mouth when she was too weak to lift the mug herself, and keeping the fire stoked against the chill of the Wyoming nights. A new kind of intimacy grew between them in the quiet hours of that sick room. It was an intimacy born not of words, but of shared tasks and quiet glances. It was in the way he knew she needed another blanket before she started to shiver. It was in the way she would watch him as he sat by the fire, his hands mending a piece of his horse's tack, his face thoughtful in the flickering light. Feelings began to stir in Emily's heart, feelings that were complicated and confusing. She saw not just a savior, but a man of deep kindness and quiet sorrow. She felt a powerful pull toward his steady strength, his gentle gravity. But the situation was too fragile for such thoughts. Rosie's health was still a delicate balance, and their own futures were a complete unknown. Luke was a man on his way to Fort Laramie, a man who ran from ghosts. She was a woman with a homestead to return to, a life to rebuild. So they didn't speak of it. They didn't acknowledge the current that was beginning to flow between them. They simply existed in the quiet, shared space of the cabin, their nascent feelings as unspoken and as fragile as the new life returning to Rosie's cheeks. It was enough, for now, to know that the burden had been lifted. And they were, for the first time, simply two people watching over a sleeping girl, waiting for the dawn. A week in Hope's End felt like a lifetime. The tiny town, once a distant, mythical destination, became the backdrop for a quiet miracle. With each passing day, life flowed back into Rosie. The fever receded completely, leaving her weak but blessedly clear-eyed. The color returned to her cheeks, first a faint, delicate pink, then a healthier bloom. The sound of her voice, no longer a feverish murmur but a soft, hesitant whisper, was the sweetest music Emily had ever heard. Dr. Vance pronounced her well on the road to recovery, his gruff demeanor softening into something resembling pride. He left them in the care of Luke, who had seamlessly transitioned from rescuer to caretaker. He cooked simple, nourishing meals of broth and stew, his movements around the doctor's small hearth as natural as if he'd been doing it his entire life. He would sit for hours by Rosie's side, sometimes speaking to her in his low, calm voice, other times just being a quiet, reassuring presence while Emily rested. A fragile domesticity settled over the three of them in the small cabin. It was a strange, temporary family forged in crisis. Emily would find herself watching Luke, noticing the small things, the way he mended a tear in his shirt with neat, practiced stitches, the gentleness in his hands when he changed the dressing on a small cut on Rosie's arm, the sad, far-off look that would sometimes enter his eyes when he stared into the fire, a look that told her his ghosts were never far away. The unspoken thing between them grew in the silence. It was a tangible presence, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was in the lingering of their hands when he passed her a mug, the shared, fleeting smiles over Rosie's head when she said something with a flash of her old wit, the way his gaze would find hers across the room, holding it for just a beat too long. But the future remained a vast, uncharted territory, and the fear of what lay beyond this temporary shelter kept the words locked behind their lips. As Rosie grew stronger, so did Emily's sense of duty. They had incurred a great debt, not just to Luke, but to the doctor. One morning, while Luke was out tending to his horse, Emily approached Dr. Vance as he was packing a medical bag to visit a homesteader a few miles out of town. "Doctor," she began, her hands twisting in the fabric of her skirt. We need to talk about payment. We don't have much, but our homestead is ours, free and clear. I can work for you, or we can arrange to pay you back once we're home and I can sell some of our stock." Dr. Vance stopped what he was doing and looked at her over the top of his spectacles, his expression one of mild confusion. "Payment, child. The bill has been settled." Emily stared at him, bewildered. "Settled, but how we have no money?" "Your friend, Mr. Kerrigan, took care of it 3 days ago," the doctor said, turning back to his bag and snapping it shut. "Paid in full, in silver, no less." The floor seemed to drop out from under Emily. Luke, he had paid for everything, but with what she knew, he wasn't a wealthy man. He was a freighter, a man who lived by his wits and his labor.
"But he couldn't have," she stammered. "He wouldn't have that kind of money on him."
The doctor sighed, a weary, knowing sound. He picked up his hat and fixed her with a look that was both kind and piercing. "He does now. The man sold the entire contents of his freight wagon to the general storekeeper. Got a poor price for it, I'm sure, but he didn't seem to mind. Said his delivery was no longer urgent. Walked in here not an hour later and put a stack of silver dollars on that table that was more than enough to cover my services and all the medicine your sister will need for the next month." The doctor put on his hat and opened the door, letting in a shaft of bright morning sun. "You found yourself a good man there. Miss, the kind that are getting harder to find. Don't you be a fool and let him go." He left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Emily standing in the middle of the room, his words echoing in the sudden silence. He had sold his cargo, his livelihood, the entire purpose of his journey to Fort Laramie. He had sold it for a pittance, all to pay for Rosie's care. The sheer magnitude of the sacrifice was a physical blow. It was a gesture of such profound generosity that it bordered on reckless. And with that understanding came a cold, terrible certainty. It was the kind of thing a man did when he was settling his accounts for good. It was an act of finality. He was making sure they were taken care of, that they had no debts tying them to this place or to him. He was preparing to leave. The realization was a shard of ice in her heart. He had never seen himself as part of their future. He was just a stranger passing through, cleaning up a mess he had found on the trail before continuing on his way. The quiet intimacy of the past week, the shared glances, the unspoken warmth. Had she imagined it all? When Luke returned to the cabin, she couldn't look at him. She busied herself by the hearth, her movements stiff and jerky, her mind a maelstrom of confusion and hurt. He had done this incredible, selfless thing, and he had hidden it from her. He had shut her out, treating her like a child who couldn't be trusted with the truth. He seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere. "Is everything all right?" "Emily," he asked, his voice cautious. "Everything is fine," she said, her voice tight. She couldn't bring herself to confront him. What could she say? "Thank you for selling your livelihood for us. Why are you planning to abandon us?" The questions were too large, too fraught with a meaning she was terrified to face. The silence that fell between them was heavy and cold, a stark contrast to the easy quiet of the days before. Later that afternoon, Emily was sitting by Rosie's side, mending a tear in her sister's dress. Rosie had been watching her for some time, her gaze unnervingly perceptive. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but firm. "You're angry with him," she stated. It wasn't a question. Emily's needle stilled. She didn't look up. "I'm not angry." "Yes, you are," Rosie insisted gently. "You've barely said 2 words to him all day. The air in here is so thick you could cut it with a knife." "What did he do?" Emily sighed, her shoulders slumping. She couldn't lie to Rosie. He paid Dr. Vance for everything. He sold all the goods he was hauling to do it. Rosie was silent for a moment, processing this. "Oh," she said softly.
So that's it. What do you mean, that's it? Emily asked, a note of frustration in her voice. He shouldn't have done it. It wasn't his responsibility. Emily, Rosie said, reaching out and placing a weak but insistent hand on her sister's arm. Look at me. Emily slowly lifted her head. Rosie's eyes, clear and bright, held hers. He didn't do it because it was his responsibility. He did it because he's a good man. He did it because he cares about us. And you know it. He's going to leave, Emily whispered, the words a painful admission. That's why he did it. He's tying up loose ends before he rides away. And you're just going to let him? Rosie challenged, her voice gaining a surprising strength. Emily, for my whole life, you have been the strong one. You fought for me. You carried me. You never gave up. You're the bravest person I know, but you're a coward when it comes to your own heart. Emily flinched as if struck. I've seen the way you look at him, Rosie continued, her voice softening. And I've seen the way he looks at you. There's something there, something real. Are you really going to stand by and watch a man like that walk out of your life because you're too proud or too scared to say something? She squeezed Emily's arm. Pa always said we Wrens were tough, but being tough isn't the same as being hard. Emily, sometimes the toughest thing to do is to let someone in. Don't let him go. Rosie's words struck home, dismantling the last of Emily's prideful defenses. She was right. Fear had been masquerading as pride, fear of being vulnerable, fear of being left again, fear of wanting something she felt she could never have. The next morning, the fear became a reality. Emily woke just before dawn to the soft sound of movement. Luke was already dressed. His bedroll was packed. His saddlebags were by the door. He was moving with a quiet, deliberate stealth, trying not to wake them. He was leaving. He saw that she was awake, and a shadow of something regret, perhaps, crossed his face. He walked over to her cot. I didn't mean to wake you, he whispered. You're leaving, she said, her voice flat. I need to get to Fort Laramie, he said, the words a hollow excuse they both knew was a lie. My business here is done. Rosie is well. The doctor is paid. You're safe now. He looked over at Rosie, who was pretending to be asleep. You take care of your sister, he said, his voice thick with an unspoken emotion. Then he turned back to Emily. He reached out as if to touch her cheek, but then let his hand fall to his side. Goodbye, Emily. He turned and walked out the door, his footsteps soft on the wooden porch. For a moment, Emily was paralyzed. This was it. He was gone. The world she had just begun to imagine, a world with his steady, quiet strength in it, was vanishing with him. Then Rosie's words echoed in her ears. Don't let him go. Something inside her snapped. She threw off the blanket and scrambled out of the cot. She didn't bother with her shoes or her shawl. She ran to the door and flung it open. Luke was at the hitching post, untying the reins of his roan. He was a dark silhouette against the pale, pre-dawn sky. Luke, she cried out. He stopped, his back to her. She ran out onto the porch, her bare feet cold on the rough wood. She ran down the steps and across the muddy street, not stopping until she was right behind him. You can't just leave, she said, her voice breathless, half a sob. He turned around slowly. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions. Emily, there's nothing for me here. That's not true, she insisted, tears now streaming down her face. You paid the doctor. You sold your cargo. You think that settles everything? You think you can just save our lives and then ride away as if it were nothing, as if we were nothing? It's better this way, he said, his voice rough. I'm just a man passing through. You and Rosie, you have a life to get back to. A home. What if we want you to be a part of it, she cried, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. What if our home is just an empty cabin without someone like you in it? She stood before him, shivering in the morning chill. Her heart laid bare. She had done it. She had said the terrifying, impossible thing.
Luke stared at her, his stormy eyes wide with shock and a dawning, wondrous light. The carefully constructed walls around his own heart were beginning to crumble. He had been so sure he was a ghost, a drifter destined to walk alone. But here was this woman, fierce and beautiful and braver than any soldier he had ever known, telling him he was wrong. He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out, no longer hesitant. "Emily," he began, his voice hoarse. The sun was just beginning to crest the hills, casting long, golden fingers of light across the small, sleeping town, and in the middle of the muddy street of Hope's End. Time seemed to stand still, waiting for his answer. His name, spoken with such raw, desperate urgency, stopped him more effectively than a physical barrier. Luke turned, and the sight of her standing there in the muddy street, in her bare feet and with tears streaming down her face, broke through the last of his carefully constructed defenses. For years, he had been a ghost, moving through the world without leaving a trace, convinced that he was too damaged, too haunted, to ever truly connect with another soul. But this woman, this fierce, stubborn, beautiful woman, was refusing to let him be a ghost. She was demanding that he be a man. He didn't speak. Words were inadequate for the torrent of emotion that crashed through him. Instead, he closed the distance between them, his long strides eating up the space that had represented a chasm of loneliness and fear. He took her hand, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around her small, cold ones. Her skin was like ice, and he chafed it gently between his palms. "You'll catch your death of cold," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. It was a ridiculously practical thing to say in a moment of such profound emotional upheaval, but it was all he could manage. He didn't release her hand. Instead, he kept it firmly in his grasp and started walking, leading her away from the awakening town, away from the curious eyes that would soon be peering from behind curtains. He led her past the last cabin, past the blacksmith's shop that was still dark and silent, and up a narrow, winding path that climbed the hill to the east of town. The path was steep, but he adjusted his pace to hers, his grip on her hand a steady, supportive presence. They walked in silence, a silence that was no longer empty or cold, but charged with all the things that had been left unsaid. The rising sun was at their backs, casting their long shadows before them. The air was crisp and clean, and the higher they climbed, the stronger the wind became. A constant, clean presence that seemed to sweep away the last vestiges of the sick room's stale air. They reached the top just as the sun cleared the distant mountains, flooding the valley with golden light. From here, they could see all of Hope's End laid out below them, a collection of toy houses and a single, muddy ribbon of a street. The smoke from the chimneys now rose in straight, unwavering lines. It was a peaceful, domestic scene, a world away from the desolate plains they had crossed. Luke led her to a small, flat-topped boulder near a twisted, wind-scoured pine tree and gently urged her to sit. He remained standing, his back to the town, his gaze fixed on the vast, empty expanse of the horizon to the east, the direction from which they had come. The wind whipped at his hair and the collar of his shirt, and for a long time, he just stood there, a solitary, thoughtful figure against the immense morning sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, laced with the grit of a story he had not told in a very long time. "After the war," he began, his eyes still on the horizon, "I came home to a place that didn't feel like home anymore. The people were the same, the buildings were the same, but I was different. I'd seen things, done things, things that change a man from the inside out. I felt like I was wearing a stranger's skin." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I tried to settle. I really did, but peace felt unnatural. Quiet felt like a lie. I'd lie awake at night, and the silence would be so loud, filled with the ghosts of boys I'd known, boys who wouldn't be coming home to their own quiet rooms. Happiness, it felt like something I didn't deserve. It felt like a betrayal of all the men who had died beside me. He turned then, and his stormy eyes, filled with a raw, unguarded vulnerability, met hers. So I left. I started moving, and I didn't stop. I thought if I kept moving, the ghosts couldn't catch up. I convinced myself that I wasn't meant for a home, for a family, for happiness. I was a drifter, a man who passed through other people's lives. It was a lonely existence, but it was simple. It was safe. I couldn't lose what I never allowed myself to have. He took a step closer, his gaze intense. And then I saw you, out there on that plain, a tiny speck in all that emptiness, carrying your sister on your back. You were exhausted. You were half-starved, and you looked like you were about to collapse. But you weren't stopping. You were fighting. You were fighting for something. And I realized I hadn't fought for anything but my own survival in a long, long time. His voice grew thick with emotion. When I looked at you, I didn't just see a woman in trouble. I saw a reason. I saw everything I had told myself didn't exist anymore. Strength, hope, a love so fierce it would carry another person across a desert. You were everything I thought the war had burned out of the world, and out of me. Emily's heart ached with the painful beauty of his confession. She stood up, wanting to close the small distance that remained between them. I didn't believe in happiness, Emily, he said, his voice cracking. I truly didn't. Not for me. I thought my only purpose was to keep moving until I wore out. Then I met you. And for the past week, in that small cabin, watching you care for your sister, watching you slowly come back to life yourself, I started to feel something I thought was long dead. I started to hope. And it terrified me. Because ghosts like me, we don't get to have hope. We don't get to have you. I tried to leave because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I stayed, I'd bring my ghosts and my darkness into your life. It was better to just be a man who passed through than to stay and become a bad memory. Now it was her turn. All the strength she had ever possessed seemed to gather in her heart. Not the hard, brittle strength of survival, but a new, softer strength. The strength to be vulnerable. For years, she began, her own voice trembling slightly. Ever since my mother first got sick, I thought being strong meant carrying everything by myself. I built walls around myself, around Rosie. I took on every burden, every chore, every fear, and I held it all inside. I thought that was what I was supposed to do. I never asked for help. I never let anyone in. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I was so proud of that strength, but it was a cage. The weight of it was crushing me. When you found us out there, I was at my end. Not just my body, Luke, my spirit. I was about to give up. The loneliness was as big an enemy as the thirst. She took a deep breath, the clean, windy air filling her lungs. You didn't just help me carry Rosie. You helped me carry everything else, too. All the grief and the fear I had been holding on to. When you held me in that cave during the storm, it was the first time in years I had let myself lean on someone else. I learned that asking for help isn't a weakness. I learned that sharing a burden doesn't have it. It makes it disappear. You taught me how to be strong enough to not be alone. She reached out and laid a tentative hand on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, heavy beat beneath her palm. You talk about your ghosts, she said softly. Don't you see I have them? Too, we all do, but maybe ghosts don't like company. Maybe if we stand together, they won't seem so frightening. The wind gusted around them, whipping a strand of her hair across her face. Luke reached up, his calloused fingers infinitely gentle as he tucked it behind her ear. His hand lingered, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. The last of his defenses, the last of his fears, crumbled under the weight of her simple, profound truth. Emily Wren, he whispered, his voice thick with a wonder that felt like prayer. He lowered his head, and she tilted her face up to meet him. Their first kiss was not a kiss of desperation or of sudden, fiery passion. It was a kiss of arrival. It was as gentle as the morning light and as certain as the solid rock beneath their feet. His lips were chapped from the sun and the wind, but they were warm, and they tasted of a quiet, steadfast promise. It was a kiss that spoke of shared sorrows and newfound hope, of two broken souls finding a way to be whole in each other. It was the sealing of a silent pact, a recognition that the long, lonely journey was finally over. When they broke apart, they didn't speak. There was nothing more that needed to be said. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close against his chest, and she rested her head in the hollow of his shoulder, her hand still flat against his heart. They stood there for a long time on that windy hill, holding each other as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Below them, the small town of Hope's End began to stir with the business of a new day. For Luke and Emily, it was the beginning of a new life. They had both come to this place seeking an end to fever, an end to running, and instead had found a beginning. When they returned to the doctor's cabin from the windy hill, hand in hand, the world had fundamentally shifted. The unspoken question that had hung between them, heavy and uncertain, had been answered not with a promise, but with a quiet, profound understanding. Rosie was sitting up on the cot, a mended blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and she took one look at their joined hands and the newfound peace in her sister's eyes, and a slow, radiant smile spread across her face. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She had known all along. They stayed in Hope's End for 2 more days, allowing Rosie to gather her strength for the journey home. The town, which had at first seemed a fortress of suspicious strangers, slowly revealed its kinder side. The blacksmith offered to reshoe Luke's horse for free. The general store owner's wife brought them a freshly baked loaf of bread and a small pot of jam. News of their story, it seemed, had made the rounds, and the small, isolated community responded with the quiet generosity of the frontier. During this time, Luke was a constant, steady presence, but he was different. The weary, haunted look that had shadowed his eyes was gone, replaced by a clear, focused purpose. He spent his time making practical preparations for their return journey, purchasing supplies with the last of his silver, reinforcing the straps on his saddle, and talking at length with the Dr. Vance about Rosie's continued care. He was no longer a drifter preparing to move on. He was a man preparing to take his family home. The subject of his accompanying them was never a question. It was a settled fact, as solid and unspoken as the ground beneath their feet. The evening before they were set to leave, as Emily was packing their few belongings, Luke came to stand beside her. "The journey back will be slower," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We'll need to make camp for at least 2 nights. I want to make sure Rosie isn't taxed." Emily nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet joy. "Thank you, Luke, for everything." He reached out and gently took the worn dress she was folding from her hands. Setting it aside, he took her hands in his. "Emily, there are no more thanks between us. We're in this together now. Your home is my destination." The journey from Hope's End was a mirror image of the journey that had brought them there, a perfect and beautiful inversion of all the fear and despair. Where before there had been a desperate, silent march, there was now a slow, gentle procession. Where there had been agonizing thirst, there were now full canteens and a shared sense of peace. Luke's big roan horse, which had once seemed a harbinger of danger, was now their gentle transport. Rosie, bundled in blankets, was settled comfortably in the saddle. She was still weak, but she was able to sit upright, her eyes wide with the wonder of the world she had so nearly left behind. She pointed out the shapes of clouds, the flash of a bluebird's wing, her voice a soft but happy murmur. Luke and Emily walked side by side, leading the horse. The crushing burden that had once been on Emily's back was gone, replaced by the light, easy weight of Luke's hand brushing against hers as they walked. They talked for hours, their voices a low, continuous thread weaving a tapestry of a shared future against the vast silence of the plains. She told him about the homestead, about the rhythms of the seasons, the spring planting and the autumn harvest. She spoke of her parents, not with the raw, fresh grief of before, but with a loving, quiet remembrance, sharing stories of her father's stubborn optimism and her mother's hidden strength. He, in turn, spoke of his own dreams, dreams he had long thought buried. He talked of the satisfaction of building something with his own hands, of the feel of good soil, of the quiet pride in seeing a herd of healthy cattle graze on a hill. He spoke not as a drifter, but as a man who was finally, after years of running, looking for a place to put down roots. Their first night, they made camp in a small, sheltered meadow by a creek, a place Luke seemed to know from a previous journey. He built a fire, and they shared a simple meal of bacon and beans that tasted, in that moment, like a feast. Rosie, tired but content, fell asleep almost immediately, her head resting on a saddlebag near the warmth of the fire. Luke and Emily sat together, watching the flames dance and the stars emerge, a brilliant, cold scatter of diamonds against the black velvet of the sky. The loneliness of the plains, which had once felt so menacing to Emily, now felt like a profound and beautiful privacy, a vast, quiet cathedral for the two of them. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Luke said softly, his gaze on the fire, at peace. "Me neither," Emily confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought my life would just be surviving, getting through one day to the next. We'll do more than survive." "Emily," he said, turning to her, his face earnest in the firelight, "we'll build something good." He didn't touch her, but the promise in his voice was as solid and real as an embrace. On the third day, the landscape began to grow familiar. Emily recognized the distinctive shape of a distant butte, the curve of a dry wash. A nervous, excited energy began to build inside her. She was coming home, but it was a different feeling from any homecoming she had ever known. She was not just returning to a place of solitude and memory. She was bringing a future back with her. When the small, sturdy shape of their cabin finally came into view, nestled under the lone cottonwood tree on the rise, Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had left this place in a state of utter desperation, fleeing a silence that felt like a tomb. Now, as she looked at it, it looked different, welcoming. The storm that had trapped them in the cave had passed over this land as well. The rain had worked a miracle. The parched, bone-colored grasses were now shot through with a vibrant, tender green. Clusters of wildflowers, purple lupine and yellow prairie buttercups had sprung up, a riot of color against the rich, dark earth. A meadowlark, perched on a fence post, let out a cascade of liquid, joyful notes, a sound Emily hadn't realized how much she had missed. It was not spring, but it felt like it. It felt like a resurrection. As they drew closer, her gaze went to the small rise behind the cabin, to the two simple wooden crosses that marked her parents' graves. The ache of their loss was still there, a permanent part of the landscape of her heart. But as she looked at the graves now, with Luke's solid presence beside her and Rosie safe in the saddle, the grief was tempered by a sense of continuity. Her parents were a part of this land, and she was, too. But the story of this homestead was not over. It was just beginning a new chapter. Luke reined in the horse and dismounted, then gently lifted a tired but smiling Rosie from the saddle and carried her up the 2 steps and onto the porch. Emily followed, her hand trailing along the familiar, weathered wood of the railing. She pushed open the door. The air inside was cool and still, thick with the scent of a house that had been closed up. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light slanting through the single window. It was exactly as she had left it, a place frozen in a moment of crisis. But the oppressive silence was gone. The space was no longer empty. It was filled with the promise of their return. Rosie, with a happy sigh, sank into her own bed, the familiar comfort of it a balm after her long ordeal. while Emily opened the window to let in the fresh, clean air. Luke did not stand by idly. He was a man of action, and his purpose was now indelibly tied to this small patch of land. He did not ask permission. He simply saw what needed to be done. He walked the perimeter of the cabin, his keen eyes assessing everything. He tested the posts of the porch railing, noting a loose one with a professional grunt. He inspected the chimney for cracks, ran a critical eye over the shingles on the roof. He went to the small barn, his footsteps sure and steady, and returned a few minutes later. "The well rope is frayed," he announced, not as a criticism, but as a simple statement of fact. "And the back fence of the corral has a broken rail. The chickens are fine, but the vegetable garden will need a good weeding after that rain." Emily watched him, a slow, wonderful realization dawning on her. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't a stranger who had merely escorted them home. He was already a part of this place. He saw its flaws and its potential with the eyes of a man who intended to stay, to work, to build. He didn't wait. He rolled up his sleeves, took the small collection of tools from the barn, and went straight to the corral. Emily stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, and watched him work. She watched as he expertly removed the broken rail and began to measure a new one. The sounds of his labor, the scrape of a saw, the solid thud of a hammer were not intrusions. They were the sounds of life returning to the homestead. They were the sounds of a future being built, one nail at a time. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a warm, honey-colored glow over the land, the three of them sat together on the porch steps. Rosie, wrapped in a quilt, leaned her head against Emily's shoulder. Luke sat on the step below, cleaning a tool with an oiled rag, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor. The silence that settled around them was a comfortable, peaceful thing. It was the silence of home. Not the home Emily had left, a place of grief and fear, but a new home, one that was already being remade, reinforced, and filled with a quiet, resilient hope. The stranger on horseback had become the pillar of their world. The month that followed their return was a season of quiet, steady work, and profound healing. The homestead, which had been a place of silent grief, slowly reawakened under their combined efforts. The rhythms of life, once disrupted by loss and fear, reasserted themselves, stronger and more certain than before. Luke was the heart of this renewal. He rose before the sun, and the first sound Emily would hear each morning was the solid, reassuring thud of his axe splitting firewood, or the soft jingle of a harness as he led the horse to the well. He moved with an inexhaustible, purposeful energy, as if he were trying to make up for years of aimless wandering in a single season of focused labor. He replaced the frayed well rope, mended the corral fence with sturdy new rails, and cleared the irrigation ditch that fed their small vegetable patch. He worked from dawn until dusk, his hands already calloused, growing harder, his skin turning a deeper shade of brown under the Wyoming sun. He was not just a helper, he was a partner. He would listen intently as Emily explained the subtleties of their land, which soil was best for planting beans, where the wild raspberries grew thickest in late summer, how to predict a coming storm by the color of the western sky. He absorbed her knowledge and combined it with his own vast well of practical skills. They became a team, their days a seamless collaboration of shared tasks and easy, unspoken understanding. Rosie, meanwhile, blossomed in the safety and peace of her home. The last of the fever's shadow left her, and her natural vitality returned with a rush. Her laughter, once a sound Emily had feared she would never hear again, began to echo from the cabin. She took over the indoor chores, her hands busy with cooking and mending, her presence filling the small space with a light that had been absent for too long. She would watch Luke and Emily from the porch, a quiet, knowing smile on her face, a silent witness to the love story unfolding before her. The question of their future was never formally discussed. It was simply lived. Luke's belongings, once packed for a journey to a distant fort, were unpacked and found their place in the small cabin as if they had always been there. His rifle rested on the pegs above the door. His worn copy of a Shakespeare play appeared on the small shelf beside the family Bible, and his spare shirt hung next to Emily's father's old work coat. He was no longer a visitor. He was home. One evening, about a month after their return, the three of them were sitting on the porch, watching the sky bleed into shades of purple and rose. The day's work was done. A comfortable quiet settled around them, filled with the gentle hum of crickets and the soft sigh of the wind in the cottonwood leaves. Luke turned to Emily, his expression serious but his eyes soft. "Emily," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I'm not a man for fancy words. I've spent most of my life letting my actions speak for me. But I need you to hear this. This place, you and Rosie, it's the only thing that's felt like home since before the war. Being here, working this land with you, it's mended something in me I thought was broken for good." He reached over and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "I don't want to be a man just staying under your roof. I want to be your husband. I want to build a life with you, right here. I want to face the winters and celebrate the springs. Side by side, I want to be a family." Emily's heart swelled, so full of love and gratitude it felt as if it might burst. The tears that came to her eyes were not of sorrow or relief, but of a pure, quiet joy that was so intense it was almost painful. "Yes, Luke," she whispered, her voice thick. "Oh, yes." Rosie, who had been trying to look discreetly at the sunset, let out a small, happy sob and threw her arms around both of them. Their wedding was 4 days later. It was not an event for the town or for anyone but themselves. It was a private, sacred acknowledgement of the family they had already become. The day was perfect, one of those late summer days that holds the warmth of the season in a golden, benevolent embrace. The sky was a high, cloudless blue. Their church was the small rise behind the cabin, under the vast, spreading branches of the lone cottonwood tree. It was the place where Emily's parents were laid to rest. But it was not a somber setting. The wildflowers were still in bloom, and the leaves of the cottonwood rustled in the breeze like 1,000 quiet blessings. Standing there felt right. It was a way of including her parents, of showing them that the life they had started in this wild place would continue, that their daughter had found a love as strong and enduring as their own. Emily wore her mother's wedding dress, a simple gown of pale, cream-colored cotton that she and Rosie had carefully let out and mended. Rosie had woven a crown of wildflowers for her hair. She carried no bouquet. Her hands were held firmly in Luke's. He wore his cleanest shirt and had trimmed his beard, and his stormy eyes, when he looked at her, were filled with a love so profound it took her breath away. There was no preacher. They stood before each other, with Rosie as their sole, beaming witness, and spoke their own vows. Luke went first, his voice deep and steady, though his hands trembled slightly where they held hers. "Emily," he said, his gaze never leaving hers, "I came into your life as a stranger, a ghost running from my own past. I was lost. You and Rosie, you saved me. You gave me a reason to stop running. You showed me what home means. I vow to honor you, to protect you, and to work beside you for all of our days. I vow to share every burden and to celebrate every joy. My life, from this day forward, is yours." Tears streamed freely down Emily's cheeks as she spoke her own vows, her voice choked with emotion but clear and strong. "Luke," she began, "I thought strength meant standing alone. You taught me that true strength is found in standing together. You carried my sister when I could not, and you carried my heart when I didn't even know it was broken. I vow to be your partner, your friend, and your wife. I will build this home with you. I will share my life with you, and I will love you with everything that I am, for as long as I live." They sealed their vows not with a ring they had none to give, but with a kiss, a deep, lingering kiss filled with the weight of their promises and the boundless hope of their future. Rosie clapped her hands in delight, and in that moment, under the vast Wyoming sky, the three of them were a perfect, complete circle. The morning after their wedding, Luke began a new project. He chose a spot on the adjacent piece of land, a gentle slope with a clear view of the main cabin and the rising sun. He began clearing the ground to build a house. A new house, Emily had asked, confused. But this one is strong. It's our home. It is, he had agreed, smiling. And it will always be the heart of this homestead, this new one. It's for us, but it's also for them. He had nodded toward the cabin where Rosie was humming as she baked bread. I'm building it close, right here, so that you and your sister will never have to be far apart, so that when Rosie marries a good man someday, he'll know he's not taking her away. He's just joining the family. We're not replacing what you have. Emily, we're adding to it. His understanding of her deepest, most unspoken fear that her new love might somehow diminish her bond with her sister was so complete, so intuitive, that it moved her to tears. The building of the new cabin became the central project of their new life together. The sound of Luke's axe became the rhythm of their days, a steady, powerful beat that echoed across the valley. He felled pines from the wooded hills behind their property, squared them into logs with a skill that spoke of a hidden past, and notched them with a beautiful precision. Emily and Rosie would work in the garden or tend to the livestock, and they would watch the walls of the new cabin rise, log by steady log. It was more than just a shelter. It was a physical manifestation of Luke's love, a testament to his promise to build a life with them. It was a fortress against the loneliness of the world, built not of stone and mortar, but of pine and commitment. In the evenings, exhausted and satisfied from their labors, they would sit on the porch of the old cabin and plan their future in quiet, practical terms. Their dreams were not of riches, but of a good, solid, self-sufficient life. The herd is small, but the cattle are strong, Emily said one night, tracing a pattern on the wooden step with her finger. If we can get through the winter without losing any, we could start a small dairy. We could sell butter and milk in Hope's End. And eggs, Rosie added. Our hens are laying more than we can eat. Luke nodded. Considering it, that's a good plan. A smart one. But the journey to town and back is 3 days. That's a lot of time away from the farm for just a few goods. He looked out toward the dusty track that served as a road. His eyes narrowed in thought. When I was freighting for the army, I learned the routes. I know the shortcuts, the safe places to camp. The homesteaders settling to the north of here, they have no easy way to get their goods to town or to get supplies back. He turned to Emily, his eyes alight with a new idea. What if I started a freight line? Just a small one. One wagon. I could make a weekly run into Hope's End. I could carry our goods, and I could carry goods for our neighbors. I could bring back salt, flour, tools, anything they need. It would serve the community, and it would bring in a steady income. It would connect us to the world, but on our own terms. Emily looked at him, her heart filled with an overwhelming sense of pride and love. He wasn't just a farmer or a rancher. He was a man of vision, a man who saw not just the land, but the connections between people. He was taking the skills he had learned in his lonely, wandering past and using them to build a stable, connected future. Their dreams, like their lives, were a perfect fit. She would nurture the land, and he would build the bridge to the world. Together, they were building more than just a homestead. They were building a legacy. The seasons turned, bleeding the vibrant green of summer into the rich gold and russet of autumn. The days grew shorter, the air crisper, and the sky took on a deeper, more brilliant shade of blue. The frantic, hurried work of their first month together settled into a comfortable, steady rhythm. The homestead was no longer a place of survival, but a place of life, a place of abundance. The new cabin was finished, its pine logs smelling of sun and earth, its single stone chimney sending a steady plume of pale gray smoke into the clear air. It stood not as a replacement for the old sod house, but as a companion to it. a testament to a future built firmly beside the past. Luke's freight line, a simple affair with one sturdy wagon and a team of 2 strong mules he'd purchased, was a success. Once a week, he would make the journey to Hope's End, his wagon filled with their own butter, eggs, and smoked meats, as well as goods from the handful of other homesteaders who were their distant neighbors. He would return with supplies and news, a vital link that stitched their solitary lives into the larger fabric of the territory. He was no longer a drifter. He was a pillar of their small, scattered community. One late afternoon, Emily stood on the porch of the old cabin, a basket of mending in her lap. Though her hands were still, the low, golden sun slanted across the yard, illuminating the dust motes in the air like a shower of tiny diamonds. From the porch of the new cabin, a soft, reedy melody drifted on the cool air. It was Luke, sitting on the top step, playing his harmonica. It was a simple tune, a slow, sweet folk song that spoke of home and belonging. Rosie was sitting on the step below him, her chin resting on her knees, her eyes closed in contentment. She was fully healed, her body filled out, her cheeks rosy with health. The fragile, feverish girl who had been carried across the plains was gone, replaced by a vibrant young woman whose laughter was once again a constant, joyful sound on the homestead. Emily watched them, a profound sense of gratitude washing over her. So deep and powerful it was a physical sensation, a warmth that spread from her heart to the tips of her fingers. This was her life now, this quiet, beautiful peace, this safety, this love. It was a reality more wonderful than any dream she had ever dared to dream in her darkest, most solitary days. She thought of the man on the horse who had appeared out of the twilight, a fearsome stranger who had become the center of her world. She had seen him as a rescuer, a savior, but he was so much more than that. He was a partner. He was a man who had faced down his own ghosts and chosen to build a new life from the ashes of his old one. He had brought not just strength and safety to her door, but tenderness, laughter, and a quiet, steadfast love that was the bedrock of their world. The harmonica music trailed off, ending on a single, long, sweet note that hung in the still air. Luke lowered the instrument from his lips and smiled down at Rosie. "It's a beautiful song," Rosie said, her voice soft. "What's it called?" "It doesn't have a name that I know of," Luke replied, his voice a low rumble. "It's just a tune my mother used to hum when she was working in her garden. It always made me think of things growing." He looked up then, and his eyes met Emily's across the yard. The smile he gave her was one of quiet, intimate understanding, a smile that held all the shared history of their journey, all the unspoken promises of their future. She felt a familiar, happy tightening in her chest. She set her mending basket aside and stood up. There was something she had been holding close, a secret she had been cherishing for the past 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. This was it, this moment of perfect, ordinary peace. She walked across the yard, her footsteps soft on the cool, packed earth. She didn't speak as she approached them. She simply came to a stop in front of Luke and took his free hand, the one not holding the harmonica. She brought it to her stomach, pressing his large, warm palm flat against the soft cotton of her dress. He looked at her, his brow furrowed in a silent question. She simply held his gaze, letting the truth pass between them in the quiet language of their hearts. His eyes widened slightly, the stormy gray softening with a dawning, wondrous light. He understood. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face, a smile of such pure, unadulterated joy that it transformed him, chasing away the last lingering shadows of the haunted soldier he had once been. He stood up, his other hand coming to cup her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "Emily," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that was part awe and part reverence. She nodded, a single, happy tear escaping her eye and tracing a path down her cheek. "We're going to have a baby," she said, the words sounding like a miracle in the quiet of the autumn afternoon. "Rosie," who had been watching them with wide, curious eyes, let out a small gasp of delight. "A baby," she squealed, jumping to her feet and throwing her arms around Emily in a fierce, joyful hug. Luke laughed, a deep, rich sound that seemed to come from the very core of his being. He drew Emily into his arms, holding her close, his hand still resting protectively on her belly. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel the gentle tremor that ran through his body. He was a man who had seen too much of death, who had believed his own life was a long, slow march toward an empty end, and now he was being given the gift of new life, a future he had never believed he would have. He drew back, his hands framing her face, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He looked down at her stomach, where his hand still rested, and then back up to her, his expression filled with a love so fierce and a promise so profound it made her heart ache. "We'll raise this child together," he said, his voice low and solemn, a sacred vow spoken in the golden light of the setting sun, just like we carried Rosie. Emily's heart felt as if it would overflow. The perfect, beautiful symmetry of his words, the way they wove the past into the future, the burden into the blessing, was almost too much to bear. She leaned into him, her head resting on his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. Rosie came to stand beside them, and the three of them stood there for a long moment, a small, unbreakable circle of love and hope, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in the glorious colors of a new beginning. Later that night, as she lay in their bed, curled against Luke's warm, solid back, with the gentle sound of his breathing a lullaby in the quiet darkness, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought of the desperate, terrified woman she had been, a woman who had believed strength was a solitary burden to be shouldered alone. And she thought of the man beside her, the stranger who had taught her a different kind of strength, the strength found in a shared load, in a helping hand, in an open heart. "The day you said, 'We'll carry her together,'" she thought, her own hand resting on her stomach where a new life was just beginning to stir. "I didn't know that you were also helping me find myself again." Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. If you enjoyed this story, please consider hitting the hype button to help it reach more listeners.